Hey, Uncle Mark.
Yes, sir.
You know, I just reported on that other show I do, Thank God I'm Atheist, about how the Museum of the Bible had a whole bunch of Dead Sea Scrolls, antiquities that are very, very important until they turn out to entirely be faked and they're just forgeries entirely.
Yeah, that's a pity because I know that they paid ISIS good money for a lot of that stuff.
They did. They paid a whole bunch of terrorists some millions.
If you guys don't know that, that's a true. That's
true.
Your Hobby Lobby money, what the glue gun you bought, that money went into the hands of the Caliphate, to which sold Hobby Lobby Christian dopes a bunch of fake artifacts. I don't think they bought the Dead Sea Scrolls from them, but I went to the Museum of the Bible when I was in D.C. last year.
Did you?
Yeah. Yeah.
How was it?
Well, I didn't go in because they wanted $22.
Yeah, fuck that.
Yeah, fuck
Does
that
it at
shit.
least come with a chicken sandwich or something?
Yeah, probably.
Anyway,
A fish and a loaf.
Uncle Doug.
A loaf and a fish. You get a loaf and a fish, yeah.
There you go. I like that. Uncle Doug, you wouldn't know anything about antiquities.
Do you peddle in artifacts,
important?
Doug?
Well, I want to talk about one specific one that is equal parts stupid and fake. But let's start out with the church that owns it. As you, dear uncles, know, the Catholic Church does not like to air out their dirty laundry in public, whether it be the Mengele levels of human torture in Spain in the 16th century, or the institutionalized slavery in Irish laundries in the 19th century, or serial child rape everywhere yesterday. They prefer a closed-door approach to their scandals. However, every rule has an exception, as is the case with one particular piece of dirty laundry that they are all too happy to put on display. I am talking, of course, about the Shroud of Turin.
Yes.
This obvious forgery and laughably silly relic is such low-hanging fruit on the derp tree that I was surprised to discover that we haven't talked about it on the show yet.
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah.
In our defense, there are many derp trees in the derp forest, and just like the arm of a starfish or Eastern European trophy wives, every time you lop one off, another one grows back in its place.
Oh my God.
But let us pluck this fruit and toss it in the bin where it belongs.
Wait a minute. Are you breaking news on this show? Is Melania Trump a starfish?
She has the eyes of a starfish.
Count the arms.
She probably has the same legitimate visa as a starfish, but go on.
It would definitely explain her Christmas aesthetic. For those out there who do not know what the Shroud of Turin is, and I doubt there's many of you, it is said to be the burial shroud of one Jesus of Nazareth that he was wrapped in after he met the business end of the Roman Empire. The shroud has a very faint but definitely recognizable imprint of a human man that, according to believers, was etched into the cloth at the moment of the resurrection. We will definitely talk about that. To us non-believers, the shroud looks like...
sorry, Doug. In art school, I had a semester of resurrection etching. We had lithography and we had resurrection making, but that was it's really cool. It really does have an effect on fabric.
Do you want to come back to my dorm room and see my shrouds?
Yeah, exactly. To us non-believers, the shroud looks like what I assume all of Joaquin Phoenix's bed sheets look like, even after just one night. So, the shroud currently resides, very coincidentally, in the city of Turin, in northern Italy. This region was the hardest hit region on Earth by the coronavirus, until, of course, we stole that honor for ourselves only days ago. We're number one.
USA.
We're number A. US 1. Oddly, the Catholic Church has never formally endorsed or rejected the shroud as legitimate. However, it has been a favorite tourist attraction and therefore revenue generator, so they definitely give it a knowing nod. In 1958, Pope Pius XII approved it as part of the devotion of the Holy Face of Jesus, an honor usually reserved for more glutinous mediums, and Pope John Paul II called it, quote, a mirror of the gospel, which is a misconstrual of what a mirror is that could only be made by someone that didn't have a reflection. So, let's start off with the history of the shroud and its rather remarkable journey to the modern day. Then we'll talk about the shroud itself, because that's where the real pay dirt is. Let's start out with the fact that in ancient Judea, as in pretty much the rest of the world, then and now, there were burial rites and rituals. The ancient Jewish burial rites were very similar to those of other peoples in the area, although there's not a ton of sources. Bodies were typically washed and wrapped in cloth, And although digging graves in the Middle East would seem to be a recession-proof industry, the rocky terrain is not ideal. So in many cases, bodies were placed in caves or catacombs, and then the family would return a year or so later to collect the bones, I guess to throw in a pot to get yourself a stew going, baby. This does require a quick detour into the New Testament. Sorry. To review the 4 accounts of the burial of Jesus. Don't worry, they all adhere to Uncle Doug's first rule of the Bible and are mercifully short. The accounts in Mark, Matthew, and Luke are all very similar. The body of Jesus is wrapped in linen, and his body is placed in a tomb or sepulcher, which is a stupid word. A stone is placed in front, and both Marys were there to witness. So John takes a slightly different and not terribly helpful tack. In his account, Nicodemus brings about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes, which they smear all over Jesus' corpse before wrapping
so
it.
much fucking ointment in the Bible.
75 pounds of myrrh and aloe. They slather it all over Jesus and wrap him in strips of linen and then stick him in the sepulcher.
Like a mummy.
They turned him into the mummy.
Yeah. Basically, exactly. And there's 2 problems with this account for the historicity of the shroud. It claims that there were several strips of cloth rather than one giant piece.
Right.
And can you imagine the Jackson Pollock level mess you would be left with after taking a recently perforated corpse, slathering it with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloe, and then wrapping it in strips of thin linen? Imagine how ghastly.
God, what an afternoon. You wouldn't soon forget that.
Interestingly, the only account that mentions the linen cloth in the story of the resurrection is John. In this account, upon returning to the tomb, Peter and John see a pile of linen strips that they had used to cover Jesus in one corner of the tomb, and the napkin, yes, napkin, that was over the face in another corner. I guess we're supposed to infer a naked, stanking Jesus stumbling around his tomb with a napkin on his noggin. But anyway, the biggest
classic gag. Classic movie gag.
The biggest tragedy of all, aside from the fact that we are not wasting our time talking about the napkin of Turin, is that the relic itself is not even supported consistently by the book it's based on. But I digress. There is no more mention in the Bible of this holy cum rag, and where it went and with who is shrouded in history. Thank you. Thank you. And although everything Jesus related has been faked and sold over the centuries, including countless burial shrouds, this specific shroud does not show up again until the all-important year of 1390. You see, it was in the seminal year that the shroud makes its first certain historical appearance, when Bishop Pierre de Arcus wrote about it in a memorandum to Pope Clement VII. And what was it that Pierre needed to tell the 7th Clement about the soon-to-be sacred shroud? That it was an obvious forgery, and the forger had confessed. That's right.
Are you serious?
The very first historical mention of the Shroud of Turin was by a bishop to a pope stating it was a fake.
No.
Wow.
That's true.
That's fantastic.
Isn't that crazy?
That is awesome.
So according to legend, it was possessed by Byzantine emperors until the sack of Constantinople in 1204 and found its way into the house of French knight Geoffroy de Charnay, who died at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. Be impressed with my pronunciation. However, the shroud remained in the house of Charnay until 1543, which is where our old friend Pierre first came to see it in 1390. Of course, if Pierre is to be believed, the man who forged it was still alive in 1390, so the shroud could be no more than decades old at the time. From then on, the journey of the shroud is actually very well documented, mostly because it remained the property of the House of Savoy until 1983, when it was gifted to the Holy See. Yeah. I'll only mention a couple more historical dates that are relevant. In 1532, the shroud suffered its first major damage when a fire broke out in the chapel of Chambéry. The shroud was folded in a silver box, which partially melted and burned the familiar holes you see in the cloth today. It was moved to the city of Turin in 1578, where it has remained to this day. Repairs were attempted by the Poor Clare nuns in 1694, wherein they sewed patches of similar linen into the holes caused by the fire. Not as a fake, they were trying to extend the life of the shroud.
Oh, right.
I only mention this because it will come up again. The shroud now resides in the Chapel of the Holy Shroud, or the Cappella della Sacra Sindone, a Baroque-style Roman Catholic cathedral built in 1668 by Guarino Guarini, which in English translates to Gullible Gullible. It's quite beautiful. The cathedral's quite beautiful because you know what they say, if it ain't Baroque, don't fix it.
Jesus.
Oh, man.
Hold for applause. And so that's the journey of the shroud. Now let's talk about the shroud itself. The shroud is a simple linen sheet with a 3-to-1 herringbone twill composed of flax fibrils. Whatever you're thinking as far as its size, you are not thinking big enough. The shroud is 3 feet 7 inches wide and 14 feet 5 inches long.
Yeah.
If you want to know what that is in meters, do your own damn research. This is America, at least at the time of this record.
Yeah.
Down the middle of the shroud, you can clearly see, if a bit faintly, the image of a naked man. Now, before you ask if you can see the holy peen, the answer is no, Mark. His hands are very conveniently crossed over his groin. The image is of a man with long hair, a mustache, and a beard. The man is around 6 feet tall and muscular. And before you ask, no, it's not me. Now, here's what I absolutely love about the shroud. There are 2 images. I'm trying to describe this correctly so people can kind of get an image of this. There are 2 images on the shroud, the front and the back of the body. The top of the front view of the image is mere inches away from the top of the view of the back of the body. This means that when they buried Jesus, they laid this sheet out, placed him on one end of it, and then folded it at the head back over his body.
Yeah, it's like a banana peel.
Yeah, but not wrapped around him, because you can imagine that would distort the image if it was wrapped around his body. Now, if that was the case, there are only 2 possible ways that these images would come out so symmetrical. 1, Jesus was in fact 2-dimensional, or 2, you know when you first get into a hotel bed and you have to spend a couple of minutes kicking out the bottom and sides so you can breathe? I love the idea of Jesus coming back from the dead on a hotel bed that had been made with him in it by a particularly mean-spirited hotel worker with no turn-down service.
That's right.
Those are the only 2 ways the image can come out so clean. So, and speaking of the image, it has always been the belief that the image of Jesus in the shroud was burned into the fabric at the moment of resurrection. Before we go down that rabbit hole, let's talk about the idea of the image itself. When you take a photograph, what the photographic film is reacting to is light reflecting off your subject. What's photographic film? Ask your parents. The image in the shroud, the image in the shroud is so obviously meant to be the depiction of a subject in reflected light, not the source of the light, right? If you shine a flashlight at a camera, what you get is not a nice still life of the flashlight, but the distorted, washed-out blur of the light itself. So just putting that out there.
You get a hot spot.
Yeah, exactly. But because we live in the dumbest of timelines, the self-evident stupidity of this forgery is not enough, and scientists have had to step in to analyze the provenance of the shroud with predictable results. So much ink has been wasted on this thing that there is even a specific term for the study of the Shroud of Turin, syndenology, if you can believe that.
Really?
Yeah, and it's a whole field, and it's...
What does that mean, syndenology?
Well, syndone is sheet in Italian, so sheet science.
Sheetologist.
Yeah.
So
According
dumb.
to believers, the shroud was made about 2,000 years ago in Palestine, wrapped around a bleeding human body that sparkled for a second, emitting some form of radiation which marked the shroud with his image. These are all testable hypotheses. So scientists took 3 main avenues of investigation: chemical and historical material analysis, biological and medical forensics, and image analysis. And bizarrely, the church has actually allowed for a surprising amount of research into the shroud, something they probably regret now, including allowing 2 very small samples of the cloth to be taken out of one of the corners for various forms of analysis. So let me run through the evidence refuting the authenticity of the shroud, and then I'll review the evidence supporting it. Cool?
All right. Yeah.
Okay, so
I
radiocarbon...
feel like one of those categories is going to be significantly longer than the other.
Truly. And believe me, I am paraphrasing. So radiocarbon dating puts the creation of the cloth with 95% confidence to 1260 to 1390 CE. Apologists have tried to argue that the addition of the patches by the Poor Clare nuns threw this sample off, but since the samples were taken for analysis were not taken from the patches, and because carbon is not contagious, these claims have been thoroughly refuted. So, art historians have determined that the depiction on the shroud is of an 11th century Gothic version of Jesus. Microscopic analysis of the colored parts of the shroud determined that they were made by plain old pigment. Analysis of the fabric determined that its complex 3-to-1 herringbone weave was very unlikely to have been prominent in ancient Judea, but maybe. Analysis of the supposed bloodstains were frustratingly inconclusive. However, at least to my mind, the presence of blood on the shroud is only proof that somebody either bled on or put blood on it.
Right.
It's not proof of anything else. The blood in my underwear right now is proof of nothing but Chipotle. So, analysis of the dirt and pollen from the shroud were also inconclusive, doing nothing to prove it's a fake, but likewise doing nothing to prove that it's real. Anatomical forensic analysis has determined that the proportions of the image are more consistent with Gothic art than with an actual human, on top of the fact that a dead body lying supine cannot actually cover its genitalia, so the arm and hands on the shroud are elongated to prevent a peep at the divine dangly bits. So,
Right.
Can I just say, on that point, that I have looked at this thing so many times and it never looks like a real person.
No, it
totally looks like a
preposterously
painting
fake.
of a person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, the real person that it looks like is Ron Perlman from the 1980s version of the Beauty and the Beast TV show. It doesn't.
Wow.
It looks nothing like a
You're
regular
right.
human.
You know what? You're completely right.
Yeah, I'm so embarrassed at how easily I conjured up that image.
Yeah, or an emaciated Father Christmas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as for the provenance of the shroud itself, we will never know, but apologists maintain that no technique existed at the time of Jesus or the 14th century that could account for the image on the shroud. This is, of course, hooey. Various scientists and artists have recreated strikingly similar images with several different techniques using nothing that wasn't available in the 14th century. One thing that scientists have not been able to do is create such an image on linen with any known form of radiation. And yes, I did say known form. It seems that the god of this particular gap has been relegated to beyond the ultraviolet. So, now let's review the evidence that has been unearthed and remains unrefuted by the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or, and this is true, STURP. Let's see here. Okay, carry the one. Yep, nothing. Not a thing.
Wow.
However, and in spite of the fact that every type of science and analysis that has been thrown at the shroud has utterly destroyed the shroud's authenticity, or at best been inconclusive, and in spite of the fact that 4 churches in France and 3 more in Italy all claim to have their own burial shrouds of Jesus, the Shroud of Turin is more popular than ever. For example, the shroud is not always on display due to its delicate nature and apparent desire to be consumed by fire. It is stored in a temperature and climate-controlled box that is a mixture of 95% argon and 5% oxygen to extend its life. But from time to time, it is brought out for tourists and pilgrims to see. In 2010,
you know what you need to preserve your miracle is a lot of science.
Exactly. Exactly. In 2010, it was put on display between April 10th and May 23rd, and more than 2 million people went to see it. So,
In 5 weeks?
Yeah. 2 million people shuffled through that church. So that's it. Let's put this dirty diving bed or this dirty bed sheet in the washer and move on, eh?
That's the whole thing, huh?
That's
it. So I'm a bearded and mustachioed fellow. So if I were to suddenly emit like a very powerful gamma ray when laying in my hotel bed, would my mustache and beard also be recorded on the emulsion on the sheet?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. It's so silly.
It's so
the
silly.
claim is amazing. I love it.
It's so silly. It's funny that we really have not delved deeply into the morass of Catholic miracles, have we?
Just a bit.
Yeah, just a bit. I think this might be our first major takedown.
It's
You're on
fertile
blast.
ground, let me tell you.
Universal Church.
Yeah, Fatima,
Motherfuckers.
we're coming for you.
Coming for you, Fatima. All right. Well, with that, let's shuffle on.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.